Welcome to another Agnostic Agile event. I'm Nabil. I'll be your host for this evening. I'll give you a quick blurb on the Agnostic Agile group if this is your first time with us. So Agnostic Agile is a movement that started several years ago, I think 6 years ago now, 5 or 6 years ago, where it was to counter the dogmatism that we started to see in Agile, the strong preferences over framework. Everyone should use Scrum, safe is terrible. Here at Agnostic Agile, we recognize that really the Agile framework that you use isn't as important as the goals you're trying to achieve, the client's contexts that you're working within, and creating ways of working that's suited to your client's context. So those are some of the principles that Agnostic Agile was founded under and what we as Agnostic Agile people try to adhere to. And we've been running meetups event like this for years to create an informed community of Agilists. So that's the blurb about the Agnostic Agile group. Tonight, I'm really looking forward to this event. We have Toby Sinclair with us. I've been trying to get Toby on the meetup for a good while now, maybe like 8 months or something, or it's definitely since last year. So I'm really excited that he has made the time to join us, and I'm looking forward to his talk. He's going to help us become more coach-like leaders, which is important to master the coaching style of leadership. To have that in your repertoire, so as a leader you're able to deal with more situations. It's certainly something that I'm passionate about, and I'm passionate to learn more about. So I'm really looking forward to what he has to say. Just a quick set of ground rules before I hand over. Please try to keep muted to minimize disturbance. Feel free to use the chat system. If you have a question for Toby during the event, feel free to log it in the chat, and then we'll try to field it afterwards. There will be time for questions at the end, so don't worry about that, and sit back and enjoy the ride. Toby, over to you.
Hey, cheers, Nabil. Awesome. So I've just put a code into the chat. So today's session, we're going to be using something called Menti. I'm sure vast majority of you have used this tool over the last couple of years. So we're going to try and make things interactive. So if you just go to menti.com and enter the code, I'm also going to share my screen as well. And then when you're into the Menti, just got a very quick check-in activity to explore how you're feeling at the moment. Please do let us know if you run into any challenges on the chat, or just speak up if you need some help. All right, I'll just give you another few seconds. No one's got any questions today. How funny is that in a coaching talk, eh? We've got quite a lot of people that chilled out. Awesome, love it. We've got a few people feeling not found, 404. Awesome. So yeah, welcome. So we're going to be doing quite a few interactive sort of polls using Menti through the session to kind of make these engaging. I know these virtual talks, as we said at the start, one of the benefits is you can join from anywhere. One of the downsides is it's very easy to get distracted at home. And I know a lot of people have got different environments going on around them, but intention is for this to be engaging, learning environment. So welcome, everyone. Next question. So we're going to be talking about some coaching stuff today. And coaching can help you overcome a number of different challenges. I'm curious what critical challenges you want to solve. And this will help me kind of think about some of the examples or scenarios we talk about in today's session. So this should give you the ability to rank these items. So what are the most critical challenges that you want to solve? What are they? We've got changing culture at the top at the moment. Okay, awesome. Change is, looks like it's going to be the winner. Changing culture, navigating change. Curious, anyone on the call who selected other? Anyone like to just come off mute and just share what one of those might be? Anyone select that or have another item that they bring to the table around the challenge they're trying to solve at the moment?
I just wanted to fill the last gap as well.
Oh, right. It makes you select other. Right. Okay. No other challenges then.
Actually, plenty of them.
Would you have another one that you'd add to the list?
It's applying or infecting senior leaders with agile mindset. Well, it also goes into changing and culture and navigating change. So it's more or less this, or also to more, let's say, infect the organization altogether with some learnings and so on, and how to approach this better. So it fits into most of them, what you have there as well. So
nice, cool. Thank you, Holger. Yeah, you made me think of like maybe one additional one that maybe runs throughout a lot of these is sort of behavior change. It's a big challenge for a lot of people. So thank you, Holger, for sharing that. So today's talk hopefully will give you some tools thinking of how to tackle a number of these. And I certainly believe that by mastering coaching skills, enable you to navigate a number of these challenges more effectively. So final thing for kind of check-in is, what would you like to learn today? So maybe think about finishing this sentence. I'd like to learn how to. So think about your goal for today and the outcome you'd like to get from the time we're going to spend together. Just curious to learn what are the kind of things that you'd like to learn so that we can kind of really focus today's session. And this will also, just doing this simple activity will also help you learn as well. So this simple activity of just adding a thought or thing that you'd like to get from today, something you'd like to learn, just again reinforces your own learning as we go through the next sort of 45 minutes together. Okay, we've got quite a few things coming through now. Empowerment. Interesting, be quicker with coaching knowledge. Really like that. Maybe that's a nice way of describing that, is maybe around the fluency, ability to have the right questions at the right time in the moment, especially difficult in those tough conversations that was on the previous one. Measurements, develop metrics. We're not probably going to cover that today, but I definitely empathize with that challenge. I was actually talking to someone about that today. It's a tough one. How to coach narcissistic, stubborn leaders. Very nice, cool. Stay calm and not affected. Nice. So yeah, very nice. Thank you for sharing those. As we go through today, just have a think about the goal that you'd like to get from this session. We'll be making it interactive. I'll take a pause about halfway through, allow you to ask some questions as well, and we'll hopefully have some time at the end for more. So I guess framing this talk for today, so coaching is a phrase topic that you've probably all very much heard about and obviously got some interest with coming here today. My experience with coaching is that I guess part of its popularity has come from companies like Google, for example, sharing that actually coaching is what helps teams and people to be effective. And Google actually did a study called Project Oxygen, where they looked at their managers and asked their employees for the qualities of management that like helped them succeed. And one of those was that Google employees reported that the best managers were good coaches. So this highlights, I think, the effectiveness of coaching, especially from, importantly here, is it's from people that are being coached and want to achieve their goals, how coaching can help people succeed. I'd like to understand your context. So your current manager, would you say they are a good coach or a bad coach? So do you strongly agree as your manager a good coach? Or if you're self-employed, I know there'll be quite a few consultants and contractors here, maybe think back to previous managers. What's your experience been like? Give you a few more seconds for anyone who's not voted yet. So whenever I ask this question, it makes me a little bit sad. So we just talked and saw like how we hear so many stories about the power of coaching and how it can help people be effective, achieve their goals. Yet so often there's this gap where in the organizations where we work, the coaching we experience from people around us, such as our manager, is often quite ineffective. And this was also backed up by some study that was done by Daniel Goleman, who wrote a book around emotional intelligence. And he actually also did some research around coaching styles. And of the 6 styles, coaching was the one that they found to be used least often. What's also interesting from that, though, is it was actually the style of leadership that most heavily contributed to performance of individuals and teams. So we see there's this challenge that I guess we'll be exploring in this talk today, is where on the one hand, we see coaching as an effective way to enable high performance, either as individuals and teams, yet its application in the workplace is often lacking. And today we'll be looking at some of the drivers behind that and how we can start to change that and create more coach-like leaders in the workplace. So one of the final things, I guess, in this kind of check-in phase of the talk is just understanding what are some of the kind of blockers, impediments, things that stop a coaching leadership style within your organization. So what are some of the things that are creating this gap between knowing that coaching is an effective way to unlock the performance in people and its application in the workplace? What are some of the factors that you've experienced that stop that? So for the person that put transactional leadership, just curious about that one. You're able to just share a bit more details about that if you're able to come off mute?
Yeah, hi, that was me. It's just, I guess, leaders who who exert influence through their hierarchy and position more than they do by empowering others.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
They have absolutely no desire to create a relationship that's anywhere near positive.
Awesome, thank you. Anyone else like to share some of the challenges they experience?
I've experienced that a lot of leaders have a lot of time pressures, and coaching, I think, is one of the slower leadership styles.
Interesting.
And they just don't have the patience or the freedom to invest in it.
Yeah, nice. And we'll actually be exploring this today around, is that true or not? And maybe some ways you can overcome that, because that's very common in all kinds of behavior change. If we perceive the behavior to be take a lot of time and effort, often we just we don't do it. So great point, Nabil. Anyone else just one more person want to share?
We got a couple of hands up. Marwan or Tina, would you like to unmute and share?
I'll try to go very concisely then. Of course, there are many variables that impact this, but just picking up some is a resource-oriented view of the system of the enterprise, and that dehumanizes many of the interactions, and also a lot of self-delusional and cognitive dissonance, I would say, where people convince themselves that they're absolutely great managers and great humans and look for facts to confirm that, and that leads to even more stubbornness and arrogance as opposed to humility in interacting with others. And also the many widely spread misunderstandings about what leadership is or coaching is a push down the throats and the minds, kind of like a funnel of people into people's heads of my opinion and my authority, or me as a manager, which has nothing to do with leadership. I mean, a child can be a leader.
Thank you, Maru. I can see your systems thinking there, looking at many of the different factors that influence this. I love it. Thank you for sharing that. And again, this highlights this kind of complex problem that exists, where it's not necessarily a simple answer to any of these. But today we'll be looking at some small shifts that you can make in the system that hopefully leads to better results for everyone involved. So thank you for sharing these highlights, I guess, many of the hurdles that we need to overcome in helping people reach their peak performance. And I guess this is one of the factors that I found to be true around this kind of challenge between wanting to coach and its application. And Michael Bungay-Stanier summarizes this really well, where this kind of simple act of kind of asking more questions, listening more, giving less advice, it's actually very, very difficult to do. And in a culture and workplace that often promotes and expects people to tell, to share advice, to be the expert, to know the answers, often these different ways of leading can come across very different and can be challenging to put into practice, even as a leader, but also a parent, and just more broadly in society. We live in a kind of world and culture that often promotes the louder voices, the telling, rather than the listening and the sort of asking. So this, in essence, is part of the challenge we need to overcome together. So I'm going to be sharing in this talk a little bit around sort of my playbook that I've used to help create these shifts in behavior for leaders to become a little bit more coach-like. And there's 3 steps that I kind of follow. So first step is really looking at identity, helping people decide the type of leader they want to be. Then it's about helping them discover the behaviors that reinforce that identity. And then finally, it's about making those behaviors obvious, attractive, easy, and satisfying. So just quick introduction in terms of who am I. So I help technology leaders become more coach-like. I worked as a software developer for about 8 years. And about 8 years ago, I actually switched to people development. So I found that most of the impediments to performance really were around people. I know it sounds cheesy and everyone says it, but got super curious about how to unlock the performance in myself and in others. So I did a kind of bunch of training qualifications around professional coaching. And since then, I've kind of focused on coaching individuals, teams, and broader organizational systems. A little personal fact for any music lovers. I know we've got a global audience here. I've performed at Glastonbury Music Festival, which is, I think, one of the biggest music festivals in the world, and is my happy place. Unfortunately, I can't go this year, which I'm very sad about. And some of you may also know me from content I produce. So I kind of built a habit in COVID of doing book summaries. I think I've written over 100 book summaries now over the last couple of years. So if you're ever curious about a book, not sure whether to read it or just want to get some bite-sized snippets, you can go to my website. The QR code here should take you to it, and you'll find a ton of book summaries where I share my takeaways, how I've applied the learning. And yeah, I generally read a book a week and share a book summary every week. So definitely stay connected on that if you'd like to learn better, faster, or kind of just, keep abreast of what's going on. And I'm based in, talking to you from London. So I think Mauro stole my thunder here. So when we think about working with leaders on their leadership style, especially around coaching, first thing I always hear is I already coach my team. And it reminds me also about, I'm sure many of you have kind of working with agile teams where everyone thinks they're already agile and they don't need the help. So this is one of the first stumbling blocks as change agents and leaders we need to kind of explore, is this idea around people already think they coach their team. And I think that some of this confusion actually comes from the dictionary definition of coaching. So this screenshot here is from the dictionary. You can notice a number of different verbs here around training, instruction, teaching, giving professional advice. So there's a lot of people understand coaching to be something that you coach at people. It's also about fixing people, telling them what to do. And this is a big hurdle that we need to overcome in order to change those behaviors. Because quite rightly, if we took this dictionary definition, telling people what to do and fixing people is probably the right definition, right? But again, through my journey in becoming a professional coach, I used to think coaching was very much about this as well, right? But I come to learn maybe a different kind of coaching. And one of my favorite quotes is from Timothy Galway, who wrote a book called The Inner Game of Tennis. And he really talks about this idea around it helping people to learn rather than teaching them. So it's very much about self-discovery of answers rather than telling people what to do, giving them advice and being the expert. It's really the coach allows people to self-discover their own answers. And just one thing I would say there, I will be referencing a lot of books through this talk. But at the end, I will be sharing like a little PDF summary of all of them if you want to get a bit of a shortcut through that as well. So I'd like to understand, in terms of your organization or the organization where you're currently working, kind of just on this kind of scale of coaching, I guess, do leaders mostly ask people what to do or mostly tell? Obviously, it's very general. It's not that specific, but just curious to get a bit of a pulse check in terms of where we are on this scale of telling to asking. Okay, cool. No surprise. Kind of reinforces the thing we looked at earlier around kind of experiences of being coached by a manager. Again, this emphasizes we've got a lot of work to do in terms of changing the needle from people telling often to asking. And the one thing I would say here is that it's easy to assume that coaching is only about asking questions. There is a place and time for telling people what to do, or being more directive. The metaphor that was shared with me when I was starting my coaching journey is thinking about coaching like learning to play the piano. You need to learn to play all ends of the scale. And I think it's the same with coaching. It's being comfortable with not only asking questions, but also giving advice and direction. And really the magic comes through knowing when to coach versus taking other answers, and knowing when to ask versus tell, when to listen versus when to speak up. And we'll be looking at how you might make those decisions in this talk today. And one of the reasons why we think about asking more versus telling is often our advice isn't great. Here's just a few of the reasons why often our advice isn't as good as we think it is. I think one of the ones I'm paying more attention to in my own leadership is the tendency sometimes to overwhelm someone. I'm particularly applying that at the moment in terms of giving feedback. One of the things I reflected on recently, even just a conversation today, was sometimes it's easy to give lots and lots of feedback. You could do this, you could do that, you could do this. But sometimes it kind of overwhelms the other person. And sometimes things that appear simple to us can be hugely complex for others. And that might not be just to do with applying the task. It might be just things going on in their internal world, whether that's imposter syndrome, confidence. So this is often why sometimes our advice isn't as good as we think it is. And that's where starting to learn to ask more can really help you lead in new ways. So when I talk through this with leaders in organizations, it can often go down the path of people saying, okay, so you want me to become a life coach. And again, this is one of the hurdles that we need to overcome, where coaching can again be seen as a fluffy, cozy conversation, it's kind of life coaching. But coaching in the workplace, especially where I focus most of my time and effort, is very much different. There is a place for life coaching, but personally for me, I kind of look at coaching slightly different in terms of its application in the workplace, which is often a more dynamic, changing environment in the context of not just individuals, teams and organizations as well. And when we think about coaching, and especially as we started with managers becoming coaches, there's some interesting studies from David Clutterbuck that shares there's actually a conflict of interest between the manager and the coach. So I'm sure many of you have heard these kind of programs for managers to become coaches. And there's an interesting study that actually that might not be the right thing to do. It can be quite difficult for you to play the role of a coach if you're also in a power sort of influence dynamic with the person that you work with. And there's a lot of value in having professional coaches outside of your organization or your hierarchy to do that coaching work. But that doesn't absolve the manager from developing coaching skills. And this is where my kind of guidance often to leaders is managers. It's not about becoming a coach. It's really about becoming more coach-like. And we'll be exploring in the rest of the talk what that actually means to be a coach-like leader. I'll just take a pause there and see, is there any, before we go on to the rest of the talk, any questions, reinforcing statements anyone would like to share? Any stories, experiences, just anything that anyone feels they can share that might contribute to the conversation?
There is one person asked, do you differentiate between a coach and a mentor in the chat?
Yeah, great question. So yes, I do. These things are never quite as black and white, but what I would say is often a mentor tends to have some experience in the client's world. So if I was, say I was working as a software developer, maybe I've got experience in software development and I'm working with a software developer on some language or systems. Sometimes I'll kind of mentor and say, you might want to consider this or consider that. So maybe I'll share a bit more advice maybe. With a coach, you don't necessarily need to have experience or knowledge of the world in which the client operates. Mentoring can sometimes be more skill focused. What I talk about would be, it's often focused on the client's external world rather than their internal world, whereas coaching often would focus more on the internal world, which would do things like less about how to do something, but more about maybe the confidence, imposter syndrome, and those kind of things. Now, there again, in the workplace especially, there's often the boundaries aren't always that clear. And the skills of a mentor and a coach are actually very similar. So it's easy to assume that a mentor is all about kind of telling and instructing. However, the best mentors that I've had, they ask great questions, they listen well, they're very self-aware of when to give advice and when not to give advice. And these, I think are shared between mentors and coaches. The fundamental skills, I think, are very similar. But that, if anything, is kind of the whole other talk around the differences. I'd be happy to kind of explore offline. Anything else from anyone?
Basically, mentor would be a subject matter expert, and it's not necessary that coach should be a subject matter expert.
Yeah, that's correct. Often that's kind of one of the distinctions is sometimes the mentor has some experience. I think the challenge for the mentor is it's easy to assume that you know the answer to the problem they're facing, but sometimes everyone's different. So the experience I have as a kind of white male, cis male, who's got a certain background and experience might be completely different to someone else. We might both be software developers, but my experience of the world and how I've experienced it might be very different to someone else. And the time is different, the context is different. So again, it's, I think for both coaches and mentors, it's just being very self-aware of what's going on in the moment. And we'll be exploring one of the skills that helps you do that in a moment. All right. So yeah, let's talk about a little bit more about, okay, so how do we develop these coach-like leaders? So today's talk is probably going to be less about what is coaching. We've kind of touched a little bit on that and the differences. We're going to really be talking about now, I think for this group especially, there is so many agile coaches, change agents are very much focused on how do we enable leadership in the organization to start to become a bit more coach-like, to create more empowering cultures, collaborative cultures, and all that kind of stuff. And I believe the key to this really starts with identity. And it starts by people starting to think deeply about who is the person who's the leader that they wish to become. And it really starts with leaders starting to think more deeply around questions around their legacy, their identity, and what kind of leader do they want to be. And here's just kind of some examples, right, around sort of, I want to be the type of leader who listens. Maybe I want to be the kind of leader who is kind of leads inclusively and encourages others to speak in the conversation. I did ask this actually on meetup.com. So thank you to these people who shared. Here are some of your answers. So we've got like servant leader, Nabil actually shared he wants to be a leader who is feared. I quite like that, actually, in a strange way. But so yeah. So what I'd like to ask this group is, what kind of leader do you want to become? And we'll be building upon this in the next sort of 10 minutes around the leader that you want to become. So just finish this sentence. I want to become the type of leader who, and as we shared some examples, maybe listens well, includes people, embraces conflict. It's something that I've been working on a lot over the last couple of years. Nice. I like is invisible. I want others to shine. Nice. I like that. There's actually an interesting one that made me think of is like a lot of these kind of very situational, right? Is sometimes you need to be very visible. So if I think about those kind of tough moments when people are going through a really hard time, sometimes you need to be more visible. Other times sort of fade out into the background. So really, really like that. Intent though, there is really nice. So we've got empowers people who they think back as being helpful. Nice. Yeah, so I think one of the things I've been talking more about with leaders recently is this idea of legacy, and what is it that you'll kind of leave behind? What kind of legacy do you want to leave? Do you want to leave behind a legacy of fear and the bad boss? Or do you want to leave behind a legacy where people are actually say, this person really helped me achieve things I didn't think were possible and helped me perform at a higher level than I ever have? And it's really these kind of things that unlock the moments for change. So when we think about change, it's very easy to focus on the what. Okay, so this is how you, the what or the how. So this is how you coach. This is what you do and when you coach. But for me, I think I found the greatest change happens when you focus on, start with the who. So who do you want to become? And often that connects down into someone's kind of values, feelings, and creates a positive kind of environment for change to occur. And that can work on any level with any kind of change that you'd like to work with someone on. So when we think about this identity, for me, a lot of these I wrap into this kind of idea of a coach-like leader. And coach-like leaders have what I call a trademark behaviours. So if you were to sit in the office or spend some time with a coach-like leader, there'd be things that you observe about them that are almost like their trademark about who they are and how they lead and show up in the world. And I believe there's probably 3 real big trademark behaviors of coach-like leaders. So number 1 is listening. And I think this quote really sums up how listening is different to hearing. You might hear what someone says, but not be moved by that. Whereas listening is really about this whole idea about being moved and really, I guess, being in the moment with someone when they share. And listening is, it's one of the hardest skills. Yet I found in the relationships that I have, the people who are great listeners and the managers I've had and leaders that I've worked with who are great listeners have really helped unlock the best in me. So I believe listening is kind of foundation to so much change in relationships. Yet on the flip side, it's incredibly difficult to do. And again, one of these things that's very misunderstood. The second one is around asking better questions. So we talked a little bit about this at the start, but really for a lot of technology leaders and technical leaders especially, it's about making that shift from being the expert to really asking questions. So rather than giving your advice and telling people what to do, about how you shift to building the behavior of asking questions and helping people find their own answers. And here's just a few kind of small things you can do to ask better questions. and just focusing on little changes over time. So just sticking to questions starting with what and how. It's a really good place to start, and just hold yourself when you're asking a question. So can you or have you, and just trying to rephrase that into more of an open question can make a massive difference. And then the last one is something I'm still trying to figure out and articulate more clearly, but is this kind of sensing skill that I've seen the best coach-like leaders have, which is their ability to sense what's going on in the moment so they can best make the best decision around what to do. Should they ask or should they tell? Should they speak up or should they listen? Should they be visible or invisible? And these are really difficult things to say in advance of the moment. And it's really the sensing skills to understand what's going on from the perspective of me, what's going on for the other person, what's going on for both of us, and then also what's going on at the system as a whole. And this, I think, is the sort of, you might call this the art of coaching, but understanding what to do and when, I believe, is a real skill that can be honed through self-awareness, social intelligence, and sort of system awareness. Allows you to make better decisions around how to respond in a given moment. So I'd just like to check with you now. Which of these coach-like behaviors do you most want to develop? Is that listening, asking, or sensing? Awesome. And the final thing I would say on this is that, again, there's a picture I need to draw for this, is like sort of the relationship between all of these. By sensing what's going on, you're better able to ask questions, but by asking the right questions, it also allows you to sense what's going on. And by listening better, you're able to ask better questions. So all of these are not necessarily individual things, but they're all related and sort of connect together in a kind of complex system that allows you to lead. But again, still working this out, and that's maybe for another day. So final section of today is really going to be looking at, okay, so now we know some of the trademark behaviors of coach-like leaders. How can you start to wrap this into a sort of leadership development program? So how can you go back into your workplace and start to work with the leaders who, as we saw earlier, maybe are narcissistic, stubborn, or you're having challenges with? How might you start to work with those leaders in sort of a leadership development program to enable them to become more coach-like? And learning and development in organizations is a challenge. This was a study that was done by Harvard that highlights that actually only a very small amount of managers became more effective from participating in development programs. So this highlights another challenge where most of the tools, programs that managers can access just don't deliver what they need to be able to succeed. And I believe there's the big driver behind this is we focus so much on knowledge as being the vehicle to change. We assume that once leaders know how to coach, they will then go and coach. Or when leaders know Scrum, they'll go and do Scrum. Reality is, I believe, knowledge is not the problem. The big problem that as change agents we need to work on is what I call the sort of knowing doing gap. Is this gap between what we know and what we do. Like, I'm sure all of you would talk to leaders and say, They all know they should listen. They all know they should ask more questions, all know to be self-aware. These are common things that everyone knows about. And a lot of the time people have the knowledge to be able to go and do them. The challenge is that it's in the application. So anything we do as change agents with leaders and organizations, we really need to focus not on just giving the knowledge, but helping with the application of that knowledge. Again, in complex, dynamic environments where often there's not one right way answer of doing things, makes it a tricky thing to navigate, but you can get there. And here's a few ways you can do that. So another really great book talks about, so how do we start to encourage this behavior change? How do we start to help people take their knowledge and start applying it in the workplace? And what I really like about this quote is it highlights often, I think someone had shared at the very start of the call, this kind of phrase mindset. And I think often we focus a lot on these kind of mindset changes or these kind of epiphany moments, or the sort of, some of you might have heard there's a kind of big life coach called Tony Robbins, and very kind of extravagant, these kind of moments of realization where suddenly your world changes and you're walking around barefoot for the rest of your life. My experience is these kind of epiphanies are very short, very few and far between in your kind of lifetime. I've found in my own personal life and the people that I've worked and helped, it's often come either through changing the environment, which we're not going to focus on so much today, but is a powerful way to influence change, or you start to change habits in tiny ways. And that's the bit I'm going to focus on now, about how you can apply that to developing coach-like leaders. So if we take the example of the identity, imagine you were working with a leader who said, you know what, Toby, I want to become the type of leader who listens, who's known as someone that people can go to and will listen and give them the time to speak and think, and really listens deeply to what people have got to say. So applying those ideas, when we think about changing these habits, there's 4 kind of levers we can use to actually make the behavior happen. And we're going to look at a couple of these now. So one of the ways is making it easy. So if we think about, okay, so the leader wants to develop on their listening skills. One aspect of that, let's make it easy. So, okay, so what I want you to do is just focus on one aspect of listening. Maybe each one-to-one for the next 2 weeks, just focus on body language. At the end of the session, just write down what you observed, and then we'll go from there. Or maybe you want them to listen out for a particular piece of words, or maybe summarize back what they've heard. So that kind of makes it more specific. And by doing that, makes it easier for the person to start to listen. So how else do you think you could make listening easier? So curious to learn from you, what other tactics you think, if you were working with a leader who wanted to become a better listener, how else might you make listening easier for them? Awesome. Really like the one, be present. I think something I've worked with a leader on is breathing. Surprisingly a good way to make listening easier, actually. Take a few breaths before your one-to-ones, or even remember to breathe during them, especially tough conversations. Breathing is a really great tool for listening, and also makes it satisfying, because it kind of, won't go into the science, but kind of adjusts your body and makes you feel more relaxed and present as well. So that's a really, really good one. There's a lot of ones around time as well. So creating time in your kind of sessions. but also being aware that listening's hard. So don't try and listen for too long. Like, I really appreciate people who attend these talks, because these are long period of time to listen. It's kind of one of the challenges with virtual. I struggle, I'll be honest, I struggle to listen for anything longer than like 5 minutes nowadays, because of all the distractions, as people had shared. So being aware, don't kind of make your sessions too long, because it's hard to listen, especially if you're a leader that's in a situation where you've got a lot of tough conversations, a lot of tough decisions, got teams that are going through some tough times. Looking out for your own self-care can be a great way to help make listening easier as well. So let's think about how we kind of apply this into kind of a leadership development program. So as we talked about, start by helping people decide who they want to become. So focus on who first, not what or how. We want to define effective behaviours. So thinking about the identity that they have, if that's to become a better listener or empower, what are some specific behaviours that are going to help you do that? So empowerment is a great one, where it sounds great on paper, but what does that practically mean in terms of behaviours? And this is where these kind of coach-like behaviours, I think, key to empowerment is listening, talking less, asking more questions, providing resources and tools to the team, making data information transparent. What are all those specific behaviours that can help that identity be realized? To achieve those behaviors, one of the things I do is I very much focus, as we've talked about, these kind of tiny habits. And the way I like to do that is through challenges and sort of gamify it. So this is something, if you go on the link, you can sort of sign up for the next sort of cohort, is this idea around structuring the learning into challenges. So one of the ways I do that is break it into coaching sprints, as you can see, very agile. And then each sprint, sort of 5 challenges, very small challenges that leaders will do to help start to adopt more coach-like behaviors. A really simple example is at the end of every one-to-one over the next 2 weeks, I want you to finish with this question: what was most useful for you? Sounds overly simplistic, but actually remembering to do that and actually doing the behavior, it's quite a challenging thing to do. Yet, if you do that, the results are actually quite dramatic, because that question really helps you learn a ton of stuff about how you can be most useful to people as well. So really, with your kind of leadership development program, once you've kind of started to work on that identity and brainstorm those behaviors, thinking about what are the tiny things people can do to make shifts. And again, as Nabil shared at the very start, often coaching can be perceived as something that takes a lot of time. I very much lead with the opposite assumption. Coaching can be done in seconds, once you know the right questions and the right moments to be able to do it. And it's really learning about how you can do those small moments and integrate them into your work day is really where you start to create those shifts. No doubt there are moments of longer coaching conversations on tricky, difficult topics, but there's so many opportunities in the work day to integrate these very small questions, moments of listening, moments of reflection that really lead to, when they're all added together over a consistent period of time, lead to quite dramatic results. So yeah, I kind of talked about that. And I guess the last thing to finish on, the thing I think that runs a thread through all of this is this idea of to become a great leader, you need to know how to learn. And all of these things around learning about yourself, about others, about how your behaviors change, really, once you accelerate your ability to learn, your leadership will become better exponentially. But so few leaders, I've found, really know how to learn. So maybe that's another talk I can do at the next Agnostic Agile. And again, another great book there about ultra learning. So last question, you might have guessed it. I've said this question a couple of times today. What was most useful for you? So this question's useful for two reasons. Number one is it allows you just a moment of self-reflection to think back across everything you've heard today. What was most useful for you? So it's a really great way for you to like think and reflect. And again, that reinforces your learning. So going back to your goals and the things we talked at the start and the things we got through, what was most useful for you? Second reason why this question is useful is it helps me learn. It's a way for me to think about what are the things from the talk that resonated or didn't, and helps me learn. And as I said, the final thing I would say is this is a really great question just to ask at the end of every one-to-one. So if there was one habit or behavior change I would encourage you after today is in your next conversations that you have with your team or with other people in your organization, just get into the habit of asking this question at the end of every session. They'll learn, you'll learn, and everyone is happy. That is that's pretty much it for today. So Nabil, I'm happy to kind of open up for some questions really. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Toby. That was really, really insightful. So guys, you heard Toby. If you have any questions, feel free to unmute. Feel free to raise your hand in Zoom or use the chat system. I can kick us off because I actually have a question.
Yeah.
So you referenced Goleman's work earlier. I've recently dived into that a bit, and I was curious to hear your thoughts on, because obviously tonight is about focusing on being more coach-like. I found one of his key takeaways is that he found that the most successful leaders developed multiple different leadership styles. So not just mastering the coaching style, but I think his threshold was if you had at least 4 styles under your belt, then that was like the strongest indicator that you would have good results. So keen to hear what you think of that. If you use other leadership styles with your work, or just what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, great question. Question for you. Was there a leadership style that you most resonated with from his work?
I would say I related to the democratic one most and the coaching one. But I saw myself gravitate towards the democratic one most.
Yeah. And democratic is about building consensus and...
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
It can be the slowest.
Interesting.
There was a lot of drawbacks when he described it.
Nice.
Many positives.
Yeah, so thanks for sharing that. So as I kind of shared, so a couple of different angles I can come at this. So all leadership is situational. So in order to lead effectively, you need to have a good grasp of the situation. So I think this is where, like, regardless of leadership style, there's some kind of foundational skills that allow you to choose, I think. And I do believe that the coaching skills I've developed around listening well, asking questions, self-awareness, that kind of sensing aspect is kind of, again, there's a picture in my mind, but it's kind of like a foundational bit that really allows you then to work out, in this moment, should I ask a question or should I just tell them what to do? Or in this moment, should I listen or should I speak up? So I do believe other leadership styles are definitely needed. All of them should be based upon the situation, which is that sensing skill, which is hard to master for you, not just your own, because I guess one of the things I find interesting with Daniel Goleman's work is he talks a lot about emotional intelligence, which is what I've inferred or understood is really exploring your internal world, what's going on for you and how you're feeling in the moment. But there's another part to it, which is the kind of social awareness, which is not just how you're feeling, but how the team are feeling and how they're feeling with each other, which again, in the workplace is so much of what we do is in relation with others in teams or organizations. But I do, as I said, I do believe that when leaders master the ability to ask questions, listen, and those kind of sensing, they're better able to make decisions and choose effective models, not based upon their own preference. Because again, it's easy to sort of say, well, I like to lead in this way, so I'm going to lead in this way. Much better to say this situation demands of me this leadership style, so I'm going to flex and try and do that. What do you think?
I think most people have a preference to their leadership style, or maybe an innate leadership style, but being flexible in which styles you use and obviously mastering the different styles, I can definitely see that leading to better outcomes overall.
And I do, the last thing I would say is, and again, I do have a bias, or I optimize for the idea that most of the work we do is more complex than we think it is. So with that in mind, I tend to optimize more towards asking questions, because usually most of the stuff in the workplace is a lot more complex than it appears, or so I tend to gear more towards accepting that as a reality. But in my own journey, that's been challenging for me, because people that I've directly managed, for example, have given me feedback saying, look, you're asking me too many questions. I need you to be more directive. So it's just, again, being flexible. But again, I would only have got that feedback if I created the opportunity for it. So, yeah.
That's great. Well, thank you so much for the lovely answer.
No worries.
There's a few other hands up. Tina, I think you had yours up first.
Hi, just to add some of the feedback. Great talk. Really found that interesting. Kept me watching and listening, which after a long day is sometimes hard. So thank you for that. My question really is around how you can, any tips on coming up against more traditional hierarchical approaches where actually that's proven that it works and therefore people are resisting change, because why would they? Because people have done well doing it the old way, and there aren't many people modelling the kind of behaviours we need to change. And so that resistance versus change at the moment, have you got any tips on tackling that?
Yeah, nice. I love these Q&As because I'm always tempted to ask questions back. It's quite funny. Once you kind of get this habit of like coaching, it's quite hard to switch off. But I won't ask you a question. But again, all of any kind of insights, advice, obviously mileage will vary. But one of the things I pick up on your question is you mentioned the question around resistance. And there's something called the law of least effort. It actually comes from physics. And it's this idea when there's two competing options, the option that requires the least effort is the one that people will choose. So whenever I think about resistance, I think about, of the options a leader is being presented with at that moment in time, which option is the easiest or the one with the least effort? Because that's the one they're going to choose. And in a lot of situations, the way I've always led, I know how to do that, so it's easier. It's also sometimes the social aspect for it. So it's actually socially more easy for me to stick in with the crowd. And sometimes the things we expect of leaders actually require a lot of effort, both requires courage and vulnerability to do things differently to what other people are doing at the moment, but also the things we're asking them to do. If we think about like Scrum, it's a lot of stuff to try and get your head around to start doing. So I tend to think one way of fighting that resistance is work with the leaders and say, okay, so how can we make, if we think about the identity and the things you want to optimize for, how can we make this easy for you and how can we start? And often by making it easier, and then even easier than that, that makes the option more attractive and viable for someone, which means it's more likely that they'll do it. And then it's just about your role as a change agent then, is once you've got them experimenting with it, it's just about how you turn up the heat. But then if you push too hard, they might defer back to what they've done before. That's my simple answer. I have a bunch of other stuff I could share with it, but curious what you think about that, Tina.
I think it's great. I think that the path of least resistance, I guess, is what I need to try and find at the moment, to find some small quick wins that show where change might actually have a positive impact on people.
Yeah, and just helping people take that first step. And I think one of the things I've found as a change agent is often you've got to make it so easy, like make it easy, then easier, then even easier. And sometimes my desire as a change agent for change to happen more quickly can often disrupt that. And I've in the past often expected more of leaders, not because of my own desire to move quickly. So yeah, but great question. Thank you for asking, Tina.
Thank you.
Awesome, thank you. I think Christian was next, and then we can go to David.
Yes, I want to pick up what Holger wrote on the chat. Maybe in my own words, it's Toby, have you ever encountered organizations or a leader who does not really buy into the idea of being more coach-like? Nevertheless, it would be a good thing to bring the organization forward. So how can you open up the situation?
Yeah, great question, Christian. So I think it comes to where do you start? So most of the time I don't start with coaching. I start with, so tell me the kind of leader you want to be. Like, what's your legacy? What kind of impact do you want to have in the organization, in the world? Depends how kind of big you want to go. But by starting there, it's really then about, okay, so you want to be a kind of leader that empowers. Well, let's have a think about empowerment and what are some of the behaviors that might be associated to that. Okay, let's take one of those behaviors. Let's say that's asking, kind of delegating more to the team. Okay, so how can we think about making that easier for you so you can start today? Make it more specific, make it more attractive. And often I find that's just a way to find the way in to the conversation, and it's anchored upon something that they want. Because again, there's a really nice quote, I think it's by Esther Darby, which is, people don't resist change, they resist coercion. So reality is, if I start going around to all of the leaders saying, thou shalt be a coach, subscribe to my development program, there's going to be a lot of pushback because people are going to feel like they're coerced. But once you anchor it based upon their identity, it becomes easier. Now, where it gets interesting is, I do believe, as I kind of shared earlier, a lot of the skills of coaching are actually applicable to a lot of identity statements. So a lot of leaders are going to say, I want to be more empowering, more inspiring, more collaborative. I want to be blah, blah, blah. A lot of these actually, once you pick away, actually, a lot of great leadership, regardless of style, really, is really around ability to ask good questions, listen well, self-awareness. So these are almost like foundational skills that if leaders develop them, it helps in a number of different ways. What do you think?
That is really interesting. It's a nice spin to start from the shoes of the other person. That's really interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, and again, as a change agent, it's about, it's not your change, it's their change. So thinking about what change do they want to create in the world. And again, something I think probably several people probably picked up through the talk, is I have a very much a bias towards making things easy and simple and doing those things consistently. And I think I've learned that both through helping people, but just in my own personal change as well, whether that's fitness, eating habits, even reading books. I think I've often found so much of the work we do is around some kind of behavior change. And again, I try not to use the term mindset anymore, because I feel like it can be misconstrued as kind of an epiphany kind of thing. I focus much more on behavior change and how can you change habits and behaviors. And I believe that's so much of what we need to do, really, to help people achieve their goals. But yeah, thank you, Christian.
Great, thank you, guys. David, you have been patiently waiting. Would you like to ask a question?
Hello. The question is, what question do I ask? There are so many. No, hello, Toby. Very good chat. A few things I was wondering about. First of all, in your list of what we like to do, listening, what was it? You had a list of 3, and I was wondering, shouldn't responding be one of that list? You can listen, you're absorbing information, you're learning information, but how do you respond to that information? And I noticed a lot of cases, maybe through language, through biases, etc. This response, even though you're trying to do your best to share information, it doesn't necessarily come out the way you had intended. So that was my first question.
I love it. Yeah, it's a good question. What do you do with that stuff, right? And I think that goes to the real art of coaching is, once you've taken all this input, it's like, what do I do? Is now a good time to, and I'm probably kind of going through this thought process as we're talking, actually. Is now a good time for me to give advice? Is now a good time for me to ask a question? Is now a good time for me to share a story? So I think the response is the challenge of when and how to respond. So I don't think I have a good answer to that. One thing, a couple of small kind of tactics I've used. So one is, whenever I'm offering advice, and I'm going to say give advice, I'll often say, I've got some advice that might help in this situation. Would you like to hear it? So it's kind of offered to people so they can choose. And often people that I've kind of managed will kind of say, well, hold on a second, I've got another thought here that I'm just working on. So don't give it me right now. Quite a lot of the time they'll say yes. But at least then it's kind of like you're offering people your advice, not just throwing it onto them. And again, just owning your stuff, like it probably is probably a deeper conversation at some point on this separately, but like owning your response and not putting it onto the person. So just this morning I was having a conversation with someone and I was sharing, this is what I perceived in the situation that may not have been what happened for them. So I perceived this kind of, say, frustration, but that's my perception, not theirs. So I think that's important with the response as well, is owning your stuff and not projecting it onto others. But it definitely gave me some thoughts, which I'll definitely mull over. It's a really great question.
Yeah, tie into that before anyone else. Sorry, let me just turn this off. Filtering. So I'm sort of still on the ideas of biases. There's a couple of things here. Is language. We all speak a different language. Yeah, a lot of us are sharing English, obviously, because at the moment it's the #1 business language. But any language that you're in and you've learned and you've interpreted, you're interpreting from your original mindset. Sorry for that word. I don't like it either. But when you're in these conversations, there's the bias, there's the language, there's also generational, right? is what is a target? I mean, I'm thinking this in target. We should be looking through a filter that we have considered ourselves that takes all that in some cases useless information and sort of enables us to have a peer discussion with someone else without this, let's say, cultural noise. It's a difficult one, but I just wanted to get your thought about that.
Yes, I'm processing what you shared.
We can talk later if you want.
No. Like, I think, I don't know if this is relevant or not, but something that came to mind with what you shared, which is connected to a couple of things came to it. So main thing is this idea especially on listening, was like the filtering, I think, is associated to the listening in terms of there's this phrase, I think Kate Murphy shares it in her book, You're Not Listening, the idea of assumption earplugs. So I don't listen to you because I'm assuming I know what the answer is or what you're saying. So halfway through what you're saying, I switch off because I'm like, oh, I know what David is already on about. I'll let him finish and then I'll tell him. So I think the filtering is a big part of the listening, I think, and maybe also just being curious. Tell me more what you mean by filtering, sort of thing, like sort of just being curious to learn.
You're looking, initially the filter you're looking through is your own lens, right? So talking about going through, psychologically sort of trying to get into someone else's shoes, you're doing that through your own lens. This is why it's actually impossible to get into someone else's shoes, right? So as I said, my filter might be, oh, I've got some biases here. Okay, this is my language I'm listening through from my cultural language. And there's some other things here. The one, actually, I rather like that, the assumption earplug, the same thing. There's a lot of these things, which is all noise that we have to reach through in order to get let's say, the epiphany that you said before. We're listening, but oh my God, there's so much going on in my head. Yeah. It's not the easiest question, but it's easiest to state what you're trying to get to in order to help the other person. It's a difficult question. I can't be so specific because you've asked me to be specific.
No. It's a really good point. And probably the last thing I'd finish on for that is, this is a great example, I think, of, I don't know. And I think that is the other part of like coaching, is embracing the unknown and like that sort of beginner's mind and staying curious. Right now, I don't know what the answer is, but I'm curious to learn and explore that with you. And I think a lot of leaders, when they're in those moments like this, where maybe someone asks them a question or a difficult problem, quite often they'll, especially when leaders feel like they need to be in a position of expertise, will think up an answer to try and get through it. Very rarely see a leader actually say, you know what, I just don't know right now. But you know what, I'm be interested to explore this with you and curious to learn more.
That's good. Yeah. Nabil, can I ask one more? I'm always like this, that. I don't see anyone else's hands up.
There's one other person with a hand up. So
my hand.
Okay, quick. Okay,
my hand.
I'm sorry. So
Booker will be next. Sure.
That all funnels very well into the last question, which is the concept of unlearning behaviors, unlearning the rules that you've learned before. You didn't mention that at all. You mentioned learning. Do you have any aspects or understanding about unlearning?
So it's good. I was actually WhatsApping someone today because there was a guy, Barry O'Reilly, you might know, who wrote a book called Unlearning. For me, I think learning is unlearning. I don't make the distinction, to be honest. For me, learning is unlearning. It's about rewiring. I think this goes back to that thing I mentioned around the knowing-doing gap. I think some people associate learning with knowledge. So getting knowledge, that's not learning. Learning is about doing stuff, taking that in, trying things, learning different ways, stopping doing things. Just as you have like good habits and bad habits, they're both habits, whether they're good or bad, whatever, right? Building or breaking is the same for me as learning and unlearning. They're kind of part of the same thing. So for me, they're the same. But you're right to highlight that there's a process of learning which is shedding and letting go and breaking those bad habits. Yeah.
Fully agree with that. Thank you very much.
No problem. Thank you, David, for your questions.
Send me the bill later.
Booger, you've been patiently waiting. Thank you very much. Let's have our last question of the evening.
Hello, can you hear me, guys?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So something about, back to David, what mentioned about filtering of the information, and I had a question posted on the chat previously. Maybe is it same, but usually quite a few people with, and I agree about the listening, and that, not just listening, active listening, we're calling it, just to understand, but then you agree on something and nothing is done. And then again, new informations are coming up. So all those filtering, I'm, let's say, trying to be a detective, so to find the gap in all those saying, and then to know to filter it out. And I agree, David, those biasing and about our culture or who we are. I'm also working in multi-country company, so it's not that easy. So maybe that's the key. What do you think, Toby? Is this a good approach? Otherwise, you will be stuck in just questions and telling, and we will be just listening, agreeing on a plan, not doing anything, and then again listening, but being a detective, so you'll know what to filter out, and then ask back the right questions and maybe find the gap in all those saying. So sorry, it's a long one, summarizing like a few things. But if something was not clear, please tell me, I can rephrase it or.
Yeah, I was trying to be a detective of your summary there.
Yes.
I was trying to filter.
Filtering information.
How would you, what you just shared there, how would you phrase that as a question?
Okay. So you've been a great detective. How to, somebody said it's accountability. How to make persons to be more accountable through active listening.
Perfect, yeah. So thank you for reframing that. That's really helpful. So this might not be what you shared, but this is kind of what's coming to me, is sometimes coaching can be perceived as kind of a passive sort of thing where you're just listening, taking it on, etc. But I think in listening, there's an active, I think the best, it's hard to explain, but I think the best listeners really hold you accountable. They're in the moment with you, and without actually saying or doing anything, there's some level of cohesion, relationship that exists in that conversation that makes you feel accountable without them telling you. So again, I don't know the answer to this, but it's something I kind of reflect on. But I do believe that with accountability, there's an easy assumption, which is accountability comes from more of a directive, pressure, fear, etc. But I believe that there is a, reflecting on my own experience, that there is moments where you can feel accountable without anyone putting that on you. I don't know.
Again, basically it's about, because it's about coach-like style, how can I pass on my sense of accountability
to
the people that I'm trying to coach them something? Without saying, I agree, without saying.
And it's sort of just role modeling that, right?
Yeah.
But you're right. It is and I think the scenario you're describing is very common, where you might work with a leader over several sessions, and maybe they say they want to be a better listener, but then in the next, you observe them just not listening well. But there is another aspect, I think, of coaching, which is also it's important to give the feedback that you experience as a coach, to say, in that moment, I observed this thing. I observed that you, in the meeting earlier this morning, you interrupted someone rather than letting them talk. Curious if you knew about that or observed it, what was going on for you at that moment, something like that, right? So I do feel like there's an element of a coach that sometimes you do need to speak up. But that goes back to this whole sort of dilemma of knowing when to speak up. And you might find in that situation that actually there was a reason for them doing that, which you didn't know about. So yeah, good question.
More very complex thing, but thanks for taking time and hearing
David,
and answering.
Bugger, they were like tough ones to close out today. Deep stuff. Feel like we could talk for another half an hour.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah, no worries.
Yeah, you're not going to get an easy ride here, Toby.
No, exactly.
Okay, guys, well, that was the end of the questions. Toby, thank you so much. This is where I do my awkward round of applause. Feel free to unmute and join me. I can see lots of videos. Awesome.
Cheers,
stuff. There we go. Thanks so much, Toby.
Beautiful.
Thanks for Toby as well. Hope you had a great evening.
Take care, later, everyone.
Take care, Nabil. Thanks for not shutting me off.
Thank you.
No problem.
Bye.
Bye.
Take care, everyone.
Thank you.